She was just 71 years old when she died alone in a hospital bed, her once stunning beauty ravaged by strokes, her legendary spirit broken by decades of disappointment. The woman who had been called the most beautiful princess in the world spent her final years in a wheelchair, unable to speak clearly, watching as the world forgot about her. On February 9th, 2002, Princess Margaret Rose Windsor took her last breath, and with it ended a life that had promised everything and delivered almost nothing. But this isn't just a story about getting old or getting sick. This is a story about a woman who was born into the most privileged position imaginable. Sister to the Queen of England, granddaughter of an emperor, living in palaces with servants at her beck and call, and yet found herself trapped in a golden cage so suffocating that it slowly destroyed her from the inside out. Imagine being told at 25 years old that you cannot marry the man you love because it would be inappropriate. Imagine spending the next 50 years watching your older sister live the life that was supposed to be yours. Imagine having every desire, every dream, every moment of rebellion scrutinized and condemned by millions of people who thought they had the right to judge your choices. Princess Margaret was born with everything, and she died having lost it all. Some call it the Windsor curse. Others say it's simply the price of being royal. But for Margaret Rose, it was a life sentence she never asked for and could never escape. To understand Princess Margaret's story, you have to understand the weight of the Windsor name and what it meant to be born into the British royal family in 1930. The Windsors weren't just wealthy. They weren't just famous. They were the living embodiment of an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe. When Margaret was born, her grandfather, King George V, ruled over 458 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. The British Empire included Canada, Australia, India, vast territories in Africa, islands scattered across every ocean. But the Windsor fortune was about more than just political power. It was about wealth accumulated over centuries. By 1930, the British Crown held assets estimated at over £100 million, equivalent to roughly £7 billion in today's currency. These weren't just numbers in bank accounts. These were palaces. Buckingham Palace with its 775 rooms, Windsor Castle spanning 13 acres, Sandringham Estate covering 20,000 acres, Balmoral Castle with its 50,000-acre Scottish Highland estate. To be a Windsor meant something. It meant doors opened before you even approached them. It meant people bowed and curtsied. It meant your birth was announced in newspapers around the world. But it also carried expectations. Crushing, suffocating expectations. The royal family became symbols, living symbols of British values, British strength, British continuity. And symbols don't get to have personal desires. Symbols don't get to fall in love with the wrong person. Symbols don't get to choose their own path. Margaret Rose Windsor was born into a family where duty to the crown superseded every personal consideration, where the monarchy's reputation mattered more than individual happiness, where sacrifice of love, of freedom, of self was not just expected, but demanded. Her uncle, David, had learned this lesson the hard way. In 1936, when Margaret was just 6 years old, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne because he wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The scandal rocked the empire. Edward was exiled, stripped of most royal privileges, and became a cautionary tale. This is what happens when personal desire trumps royal responsibility. That abdication had profound consequences for Margaret's family. It meant her father, Albert, a shy, stammering man who had never wanted or expected to be king, was suddenly crowned King George VI. It meant her older sister, Elizabeth, became heir to the throne, and it meant that for the rest of her life, Margaret would be reminded, personal happiness cannot be allowed to threaten the monarchy again. Princess Margaret Rose was born on August 21st, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland. Britain was just beginning to feel the effects of the Great Depression. But inside Glamis Castle, a sprawling medieval fortress with fairy tale turrets, none of that mattered. The birth was announced by a 21-gun salute. Newspapers around the world carried the story on their front pages. She was the first royal baby born in Scotland in over 300 years. Her parents were Prince Albert, Duke of York, who would become King George VI, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Duchess of York. Margaret's father, Bertie, was a kind, dutiful man plagued by a severe stammer. He suffered from chronic anxiety. Margaret's mother, Elizabeth, was charming, vivacious, with a steel core beneath her soft exterior. But normal for the York family meant something very different from normal for anyone else. Margaret grew up at 145 Piccadilly, the family's 25-room London townhouse, staffed by servants, nursery maids, a cook, footmen, and chauffeurs. The sisters were never sent to school. Instead, they were educated at home by a governess, Marion Crawford. The curriculum focused on history, literature, music, and languages, but was notably weak in mathematics and sciences. Why would princesses need advanced education? From an early age, everyone could see that Margaret was different from her sister. Elizabeth, Lilibet, was serious, dutiful, determined to please. Margaret was her mother's daughter. She was beautiful, even as a child, with deep blue eyes and dark hair. She was witty, charming, quick with a clever remark. She had a natural talent for performance. But Margaret was also willful. She had tantrums when she didn't get her way. She pushed boundaries in ways Elizabeth never would. Margaret craved attention because attention made her feel special, made her feel like she mattered. But she only received that attention when she was performing, being charming, being entertaining. And Margaret learned early. When you're second, you have to work harder to be seen. Then came December 11th, 1936. Everything changed. Margaret was 6 years old when her uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson. For Elizabeth, the abdication meant duty crashed down on her shoulders at age 10. She understood that someday she would be queen. For Margaret, the abdication meant something different. It meant her father was suddenly king. It meant they had to move from their comfortable townhouse to Buckingham Palace, that cold, drafty, 775-room monument to monarchy. It meant her sister was now heir presumptive. And it meant Margaret was now just the spare, the backup, the one who didn't matter quite as much. The move to Buckingham Palace happened quickly. For the two girls, it was traumatic. Buckingham Palace was a vast, impersonal labyrinth. The nursery was on the top floor, miles from their parents' quarters. The corridors were long and cold. Margaret, who had always been somewhat clingy with her mother, now rarely saw her. The new queen was constantly busy. The new king was even more absent, overwhelmed by responsibilities he'd never wanted. The sisters had each other, but they were growing apart. Elizabeth was being prepared for queenship. Margaret was... what? She was the pretty one, the entertaining one. But what was she for? That question would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. During World War II, the sisters lived primarily at Windsor Castle. In 1940, Margaret and Elizabeth performed in their first radio broadcast, part of the BBC's Children's Hour programme. That broadcast made Margaret famous in her own right for the first time. People loved her voice, her charm, her presence. But it was also the first time she experienced what would become a curse, being compared to her sister. Elizabeth was always the future queen, mentioned first. Margaret was always, and her younger sister, always second. On May 8th, 1945, VE Day, the war in Europe ended. Margaret was 14 years old. That night, she and Elizabeth slipped out of Buckingham Palace to join the celebrating crowds in the streets of London. For Margaret, it was a taste of freedom, of being just a regular person in a crowd, dancing and laughing without everyone watching, judging, expecting. She wanted more of that feeling. She would spend the rest of her life chasing it. The year 1947 brought massive changes. Elizabeth, now 21, married Philip Mountbatten on November 20th. The wedding was a national celebration. Margaret, 17, served as one of 8 bridesmaids. She looked beautiful, smiled for the cameras, played her role perfectly. But inside, she must have been screaming. What about me? When do I get my turn? The answer would come in the most tragic way possible. In 1944, Group Captain Peter Wooldridge Townshend had been appointed an equerry to King George VI. Townshend was a decorated Royal Air Force pilot, a war hero. He was handsome, tall, with bright blue eyes and a warm smile. He was also 16 years older than Margaret, married with 2 young sons, and completely inappropriate as a romantic prospect for a princess. None of that mattered to Margaret. She fell in love with him anyway. Nobody knows exactly when the relationship began. Townshend later wrote that he first noticed Margaret during the royal tour of South Africa in 1947. She was 16, still a girl, but on the cusp of womanhood, beautiful and vivacious, and desperate for someone to see her as more than just Elizabeth's little sister. Townshend saw her. For Margaret, he was everything she'd been missing. He paid attention to her, really listened when she spoke. He treated her as an intelligent adult. He shared her love of music and art. He made her laugh. And he was kind. In a family where emotional expression was considered weakness and affection was rationed out in careful doses, Peter Townshend offered Margaret something she'd been starving for: unconditional warmth. In December 1952, Townshend separated from his wife. The divorce was finalized in November 1952. He was now technically available. Then came February 6th, 1952. Everything changed. On February 6th, 1952, at Sandringham House, King George VI died in his sleep at age 56. He had been in poor health for years. Smoking had destroyed his lungs. Elizabeth was in Kenya when she received the news. She flew home immediately to assume her role as Queen Elizabeth II. She was 25 years old. Margaret was at Sandringham with her mother when her father died. She was 21 years old. The loss was devastating. Margaret had adored her father. He had been the one person who never compared her to Elizabeth, who seemed to love her simply for being herself. He had called her his pet, and now he was gone. For Margaret, her father's death marked the end of any fantasy that her life might somehow become equal to her sister's. Elizabeth wasn't just the older sister anymore. She was the queen, the most important woman in Britain. And Margaret was... what? She was Princess Margaret, younger sister to the Queen. She had no defined role, no clear purpose. Her job was simply to be royal, to look pretty at events, to support her sister. That's it. Is it any wonder she clung to Peter Townshend like a lifeline? On the day of Elizabeth's coronation, June 2nd, 1953, Margaret made a mistake. Or perhaps it wasn't a mistake. Perhaps it was a deliberate declaration. As she stood talking with Townsend before the ceremony at Westminster Abbey, she reached up and brushed a piece of lint from his uniform. It was an intimate gesture, unconscious, the kind of thing you do for someone you love. A journalist saw it, and suddenly, everyone knew. The secret was out. What happened next would define the rest of Margaret's life. The revelation that Princess Margaret was in love with a divorced man sent shockwaves through Britain. "Princess Margaret in love with divorced courtier," screamed the headlines. The problem wasn't just that Townsend was divorced. The problem was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required members of the royal family to obtain the monarch's permission to marry. And Margaret's sister, as Queen, was also Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a church that, at that time, did not permit divorced persons to remarry if their former spouse was still living. The government made its position clear. If Margaret married Townsend, she would have to renounce her royal titles, her place in the succession, and her income. She would be exiled from the family, just as Edward VIII had been. For Margaret, at 23 years old, this was unbearable. The palace devised a cruel solution. Townsend was sent away. He was reassigned to Brussels, effectively exiling him. The idea was that distance and time would kill the romance. On July 15th, 1953, Peter Townsend left for Brussels. Margaret was devastated. She had lost her father just 17 months earlier. Now she was losing the only man who had made her feel loved. They agreed to wait. 2 years. When Margaret turned 25 on August 21st, 1955, she would no longer need the Queen's permission to marry. They would wait, and then they would be together. But those 2 years were torture for Margaret. She threw herself into royal duties, but friends noticed she was drinking more, smoking heavily, staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning, going to parties, dancing at nightclubs. The press called her the party princess. What they didn't understand was that she was drowning. The parties, the drinking, these weren't signs of a frivolous personality. They were signs of a woman desperately trying to feel something other than the crushing weight of her circumstances. In August 1955, Margaret turned 25. Townsend returned to London. They talked for hours. They discussed their options. And then the government made things clear. Even though Margaret no longer needed the Queen's permission, Parliament would pass a bill removing her titles and income anyway. But there was another complication. Townsend's 2 sons. He had joint custody. If he married Margaret and was effectively exiled, he would lose his children. Could Margaret ask the man she loved to choose between her and his sons? On October 31st, 1955, Princess Margaret released a statement. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." It was over. Peter Townsend left Britain again. He would eventually marry a young Belgian woman and have a daughter. And Margaret. Margaret was 25 years old, heartbroken, and trapped. She had chosen duty, just like she'd been taught. And it destroyed her. For the next 3 years, Margaret spiraled. She partied harder, drank more, smoked more. She dated various men, but seemed unable to commit to any of them. Then, in early 1958, Margaret met Anthony Armstrong Jones at a dinner party. Tony was a photographer, handsome, charming, artistic, and most importantly, not from the traditional aristocratic world. He was creative, irreverent, funny. He introduced her to a bohemian world of artists and actors. He was also, as would become clear much later, deeply wrong for her. But Margaret, still reeling from losing Peter Townsend, didn't see the warning signs. She was 27 years old, desperate to prove she could move on, desperate to show the world she could be happy. Tony proposed in early 1960, and Margaret accepted immediately. The wedding took place on May 6, 1960, at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding to be televised, with an estimated 300 million people worldwide watching. It looked perfect from the outside. But behind the cameras was a marriage that was doomed from the start. The problem with Margaret and Tony's marriage was simple. They were both narcissists competing for the spotlight. Margaret had been raised as a princess, accustomed to being the centre of attention. Tony had a massive ego and ambition. He wanted to be recognised as a serious artist, not just Princess Margaret's husband. He resented playing second fiddle to her royal status. From the beginning, there were problems. Tony was bisexual. Throughout their marriage, he would have affairs with both men and women. Margaret, discovering his infidelity, would retaliate with her own affairs. Their home, apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, became a battleground. They would have screaming fights, throwing objects, saying cruel things. Tony particularly enjoyed humiliating Margaret about her weight. "Are you really going to eat that?" he would say in front of dinner guests. Margaret, in turn, would remind him of his lower social status. "At least I was born royal," she would snap. It was toxic. Deeply, profoundly toxic. They had children. David, Viscount Linley, was born on November 3rd, 1961. Sarah was born on May 1st, 1964. Margaret loved her children, but she wasn't a natural mother. She had never been mothered in a warm, affectionate way herself. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Margaret and Tony maintained a public facade while privately living increasingly separate lives. Margaret began spending more time on the Caribbean island of Mustique, where she had built a house, Les Jolies Eaux. It was on Mustique that Margaret met Roddy Llewellyn. In 1973, Margaret was 43 years old. Her marriage to Tony was essentially over. She was drinking heavily. Reports suggest she was going through a bottle of whiskey a day. She was smoking 60 cigarettes a day. Then she met Roddy Llewellyn. He was 25 years old, 17 years younger than Margaret, and stunningly handsome. He was a gardener, charming but unfocused. They were introduced at a house party on Mustique, and the attraction was immediate. For Margaret, Roddy represented youth, beauty, uncomplicated affection. They began an affair. On February 26, 1976, the News of the World published photographs of Margaret and Roddy together on Mustique. The scandal was massive. The press crucified Margaret. They called her irresponsible, immoral, a disgrace to the royal family. On March 19, 1976, Kensington Palace announced that Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowdon were separating. The official divorce came on July 11, 1978, making Margaret the first senior royal to divorce since 1901. The Roddy relationship was never going to work long-term. They had nothing in common except mutual neediness. By 1981, the relationship had petered out. Roddy married someone else. Margaret was 50 years old, divorced, alone, her children mostly grown, her reputation in tatters, and she had 20 more years to live. The 1980s and 1990s were a slow, painful decline for Princess Margaret. She continued to perform royal duties, but her heart wasn't in it. She looked increasingly unwell, puffy from alcohol, her voice deepened from chain smoking. In 1985, Margaret had a portion of her left lung removed due to disease caused by smoking. Doctors warned her to quit. She cut back slightly on smoking, but continued drinking heavily. Friends remember Margaret as increasingly bitter and difficult. She would make cutting remarks about people. She became obsessed with royal protocol. It was as if, having lost everything else, she clung to the only thing that made her special, her royal status. There were moments of joy. Her children grew up and had children of their own. She loved being granny to them. But mostly there was loneliness. Margaret would spend evenings alone at Kensington Palace, drinking, smoking, watching television. In 1998, she scalded her feet badly in a hot bath, and the injuries never properly healed, leading to mobility problems. Then came the strokes. The first stroke hit on February 23, 1998, while Margaret was on Mustique. She was 67 years old. She lost vision in one eye and had difficulty with coordination. A second, more severe stroke came in March 2001. This one affected her speech and left her partially paralyzed. She was confined to a wheelchair, could barely speak clearly, needed constant care. For someone who had been so concerned with appearance, this was a cruel fate. She could no longer attend public events. She was, essentially, invisible. On February 9, 2002, at 6:30 a.m., Princess Margaret Rose Windsor died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London. She was 71 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac problems following her strokes. The Queen was informed immediately. The announcement was made to the public later that day. Margaret's death was overshadowed almost immediately by another royal death. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died just 7 weeks later on March 30, 2002, at age 101. At Margaret's funeral on February 15, 2002, at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, only 450 people attended, a small funeral by royal standards. According to Margaret's wishes, her body was cremated, unusual for royals. Her ashes were placed in the royal vault at St George's Chapel, alongside her father's coffin. Even in death, Margaret was an afterthought, overshadowed by her mother's death. The public reaction to Margaret's death was mixed. Some newspapers ran sympathetic obituaries, calling her a tragic figure. Others were harsher, calling her difficult, spoiled, and a burden on the taxpayer. Unlike Princess Diana, whose death 5 years earlier had sparked an outpouring of national grief, Margaret's death was met with a shrug. There were no crowds outside Kensington Palace, no seas of flowers. The world had moved on from Princess Margaret long before she died. For Queen Elizabeth II, the loss of her sister was devastating, though she showed it only in private. The two had grown apart over the years, but they were sisters, the only people who truly understood what it was like to grow up as they had. For Margaret's children, David and Sarah, their mother's death was complicated. They loved her, but their relationship had been difficult. Sarah later said, "She was a complex woman, but she was our mother, and we loved her." The legacy of Princess Margaret is complicated. She's remembered as a tragic figure, but also as a difficult one. She was seen as both victim and perpetrator, both sympathetic and spoiled. Think about everything Margaret missed. She never got to marry the man she truly loved. She never had a happy marriage. She never found a clear purpose or role. She never experienced the freedom that most people take for granted. Years later, Princess Anne would say something revealing about her aunt. She had an almost unenviable life. She had the position, but she didn't have the role. That encapsulates Margaret's tragedy perfectly. She had all the constraints of being royal, but none of the compensations. She wasn't going to be queen. She wasn't given a meaningful job. She was just there. Margaret's story has influenced how the royal family operates today. After witnessing what the spare role did to Margaret, the Queen worked to ensure that younger royals had more freedom, more purpose. She's been portrayed in films and television shows, most notably in the Netflix series The Crown. Books continue to be written about her. In recent years, there's been a reassessment of Margaret's life. Modern audiences tend to view her more sympathetically. We now understand that what looked like partying and bad behaviour were actually symptoms of depression and substance abuse. Princess Margaret is remembered as someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's mother. But mostly, she's remembered as a cautionary tale about the cost of duty, about the price of being born into a golden cage. Princess Margaret Rose Windsor was more than just a tragic headline. She was a real person with dreams, desires, talents, and flaws. She was a woman who wanted desperately to be loved for herself, not for her royal status. The weight of the Windsor name, the expectations of being royal, none of it could protect her from the very human needs for love, purpose, and freedom. In fact, those things were exactly what destroyed her. Margaret Rose was born with everything except the one thing that mattered most: the freedom to live her own life. She spent 71 years being told what to do, where to go, how to behave, who to love. She spent 71 years being compared to her sister, being reminded that she wasn't quite important enough to matter, but too important to be left alone. And in the end, she died as she had lived, overshadowed by her family, her death less important than her mother's. Princess Margaret should be remembered as a woman who tried, desperately, to find happiness in a system designed to deny her exactly that. She should be remembered as a reminder that duty without compassion is cruelty, that tradition without flexibility is a prison. She never got to build a life with Peter Townsend. She never got to experience a happy marriage. She never got to be free. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories about the real people behind the crowns and titles. Princess Margaret's story reminds us that no amount of privilege can protect you from pain. And sometimes, the golden cage is the cruelest prison of all.